His baby wouldn't stop screaming, and the doctors had no answer. The nights bled into days, and still no one could soothe that tiny, piercing wail. Yet when I, a simple nanny, held his baby, the millionaire's tears said everything. Maybe you're taking care of children whose parents never notice your efforts, or cleaning up while the house is quiet. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I promise, today's story will touch your heart. I sit here now with my hands folded, still worn from years of folding those tiny clothes, washing bottles at midnight, and wiping tears that weren't always the baby's. From the other side of that sprawling Manhattan penthouse, laughter still echoes in my memory. The family's laughter. A sound I learned to bear quietly, like background music to my invisible life. The scent of warm milk lingers in my mind from that spotless kitchen where bottles were left untouched, where I stood alone at 3 a.m, warming formula while the city slept beyond those floor-to-ceiling windows. I carry exhaustion deeper than muscle and bone, a tenderness worn like a second skin, and a sadness heavier than any silence could hold. This is the story of endless labor wrapped in love that no one saw, no one named, no one even thanked. But before I tell you how it all unraveled, let me take you back to where it began. 6 years ago, I stepped through those marble doors for the first time, clutching my small suitcase and the employment contract that would change everything. The agency had called me at 7 a.m. Emergency placement, they said. Millionaire family on the Upper East Side needs someone immediately. I was 58 then, still believing that hard work and genuine care would be enough to earn respect in any household. Richard Blackstone owned half the commercial real estate between Midtown and the financial district. His investment portfolio included Bitcoin holdings worth millions, stock market assets that generated more in dividends each month than I made in a year, and a business empire that stretched from Manhattan to Miami. When I first saw him that Tuesday morning, he was pacing the living room in a $1,000 suit, phone pressed to his ear, discussing some deal involving European markets and cryptocurrency fluctuations, while his newborn son screamed in the nursery upstairs. "The nanny," he said when he saw me, barely glancing up from his phone. Not hello or welcome or even thank you for coming. Just those 2 words, as if I were a piece of furniture being delivered. The baby's cries pierced through the walls of that penthouse like sirens. I climbed those marble stairs, following the sound, and found him in a nursery that cost more than most people's cars. Imported Italian furniture, hand-painted murals, toys that would never be played with properly. But in the center of all that luxury was a tiny, desperate child whose cries spoke of something deeper than hunger or a wet diaper. I picked him up, Little Thomas, they called him, and felt his tiny body trembling against my chest. His mother, Catherine, stood in the doorway wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her manicured nails drumming against the doorframe. "The pediatrician says there's nothing wrong with him," she said, exasperation sharp in her voice. "He just cries, all the time. The last nanny quit after 2 weeks." But I knew better. I'd raised my own daughter decades earlier, before life forced impossible choices on me. I'd cared for dozens of children through agencies, in homes where I was background scenery to lives more important than mine. This baby's cry wasn't just fussiness, it was communication, desperation, a plea for understanding that everyone else was too busy or too proud to hear. I held Thomas close, feeling his heartbeat against mine, and began to hum an old lullaby my grandmother used to sing. Something shifted in his tiny body. The screaming softened to whimpers, then to quiet breathing. For the first time in weeks, according to his parents, Thomas fell asleep peacefully. "How did you do that?" Catherine whispered, genuine amazement in her voice. I could have told her about the way babies respond to certain rhythms, about how anxiety travels from parent to child, about the importance of skin contact and consistent caregiving. Instead, I simply said, Sometimes they just need to feel safe. Richard appeared in the doorway, still holding his phone but no longer talking. He watched his son sleep in my arms with an expression I couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe, or relief. "Keep doing whatever that was," he said quietly, then disappeared again into his world of conference calls and profit margins. Those first weeks blurred together in a haze of feedings every 2 hours, loads of laundry that never seemed to end, and nights when I barely slept. The Blackstone fortune meant nothing when Thomas refused a bottle or spiked a fever. Money couldn't buy the patience needed to rock a colicky baby at 4 in the morning, or the intuition to recognize the difference between tired cries and pain cries. I lived in a small room off the kitchen, furnished with basics: a single bed, a dresser, a chair by the window where I could watch Central Park in the distance. My salary was decent by nanny standards, though it represented pocket change to people whose net worth fluctuated by millions based on daily stock market movements. But it wasn't about the money for me. It never had been. I watched Catherine drift through the apartment like a beautiful ghost, always dressed for somewhere else. Charity galas, museum openings, lunch meetings with other wealthy wives who treated philanthropy like a competitive sport. She loved Thomas in the abstract way people love expensive art, proud of its existence, pleased by others' admiration, but ultimately more comfortable when it was maintained by someone else. Richard was different. Busy, yes, constantly juggling deals and investments, but I caught him sometimes standing in the nursery doorway when he thought no one was looking. His business empire demanded everything. 18-hour days managing assets, coordinating with international markets, monitoring cryptocurrency portfolios that could make or lose fortunes overnight. But in those quiet moments watching his son sleep, something softer flickered in his eyes. The first real crisis came when Thomas was 4 months old. I'd noticed subtle changes in his feeding patterns, the way he arched his back during bottles, how he seemed to be in pain even when he wasn't crying. I mentioned it to Catherine, who dismissed it as normal baby behavior. I tried to bring it up with Richard, but he was in the middle of a major acquisition deal involving several Manhattan properties and barely heard me. "Babies cry," Catherine said when I persisted. "That's what they do. The pediatrician said he's fine." But I knew he wasn't fine. I'd kept detailed notes in a small notebook. Feeding times, sleep patterns, crying episodes, everything I'd learned in my years of childcare. The patterns were clear to me, even if they were invisible to his parents. One Thursday evening in November, everything changed. Richard was in his home office, managing some crisis with his European investments, while Catherine was getting ready for another charity event. Thomas had been fussier than usual all day, and by evening, he was inconsolable. Not his normal crying. Something different, more desperate. I was holding him in the nursery when his little body suddenly went rigid. His breathing became shallow and rapid. His temperature spiked. I called for Richard, my voice cutting through the apartment with urgency I'd never allowed myself before. He appeared in the doorway, phone still pressed to his ear, irritation flashing across his face until he saw my expression. I watched him take in the scene. Me holding his son, my own face pale with fear, Thomas's labored breathing filling the silence between us. "Call 911, I said quietly. "Now." For the first time since I'd known him, Richard Blackstone looked uncertain. The confident millionaire who commanded boardrooms and managed millions in assets stood frozen, watching his son struggle to breathe in my arms. I made the call myself, one hand holding Thomas, the other dialing while I explained the symptoms to the dispatcher. Richard stood beside me as we waited for the ambulance, his expensive suit wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled from running his hands through it. "What's wrong with him?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I've been trying to tell you both that something wasn't right." The paramedics arrived within minutes, their equipment and expertise filling the pristine nursery with controlled chaos. They worked quickly, efficiently. asking questions I was prepared to answer because I'd been paying attention. Feeding schedules, sleep patterns, when the symptoms had started. All the details I'd been tracking in my notebook while everyone else was too busy to notice. At the hospital, we waited in a sterile room that smelled of disinfectant and fear. Richard sat beside me, his phone silent for once, his attention completely focused on the closed door where doctors examined his son. Catherine arrived in a rush of perfume and anxiety, still wearing her evening gown from whatever event she'd left. "What happened?" she demanded. "Is he okay?" The doctor who finally emerged looked tired but relieved. "Severe reflux," he explained. It was causing him significant pain and making it difficult for him to keep food down. Left untreated, it could have led to serious complications. "But the pediatrician said," Catherine started. "Sometimes these conditions develop gradually," the doctor continued. "The symptoms can be subtle at first. You're lucky your caregiver recognized the signs and acted quickly." Richard turned to look at me then, really look at me, as if seeing me for the first time. "You knew," he said. It wasn't a question. "I suspected," I corrected. "I tried to tell you both." The weight of that moment hung between us. The recognition that I, the hired help, had been the only one truly watching his child, the only one who'd seen past the crying to the pain underneath, the only one who'd cared enough to insist that something was wrong. Thomas recovered quickly once he was properly treated. The reflux medication worked within days, and suddenly we had a completely different baby, one who smiled, who slept peacefully, who didn't scream in agony after every feeding. The transformation was remarkable, and it changed something fundamental in how Richard saw me. "I owe you an apology," he said one morning, finding me in the kitchen preparing Thomas's bottle. "And more than that, I should have listened to you." I looked up at him, this powerful man who controlled so much wealth that his morning coffee cost more than many people made in a day, and saw something I'd never expected: humility. "You were busy," I said simply, "too busy to listen about my own son." He shook his head. "That's not an excuse." From that day forward, he asked my opinion about Thomas's care. He wanted to know about developmental milestones, sleep schedules, feeding changes. He started spending more time in the nursery, not just as an observer, but as a participant. I taught him how to recognize Thomas's different cries, how to burp him effectively, how to hold him so he felt secure. Catherine's response was different. She seemed almost resentful of my growing importance in Thomas's life, as if my competence somehow diminished her role as his mother. She began making small comments. "Of course you'd know about that," or "I suppose we should ask the expert," always with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The truth was, I was becoming more than Thomas's caregiver. I was becoming his translator, the bridge between his needs and his parents' busy lives. I knew when he was getting a tooth because he drooled more and chewed his fists. I could tell by his morning mood whether he was coming down with something. I celebrated his first real smile, his first time rolling over, his first successful attempt at sitting up. And slowly, painfully, I began to love him the way I'd once loved my own daughter, Sarah. Her name was Sarah, and I'd given birth to her when I was 19 and unmarried in a world that didn't forgive such things. The choice to give her up for adoption had torn something inside me that never quite healed. For 40 years I'd carried that wound, that wondering, that love with nowhere to go. With Thomas, that love found a home again. I poured all my maternal instincts, all my delayed devotion into caring for this little boy who needed me. When he learned to crawl, I was the one cheering him on from across the room. When he took his first steps, it was toward my outstretched arms. When he spoke his first word, "Mama," he was looking directly at me. Catherine was at a spa weekend in the Hamptons that day. Richard was in his office on a video conference with investors in Tokyo, discussing some complex deal involving cryptocurrency and international real estate holdings. I was the only one who heard Thomas say that precious, complicated word. I should have corrected him, should have taught him to say Mama for Catherine, save that milestone for his actual mother. Instead, I swept him up in my arms and held him close, letting myself pretend, just for a moment, that he really was mine. But in wealthy households like the Blackstones, there are always people watching, always someone ready to report back to the family about what the help is doing. The housekeeper, Maria, had seen the whole thing. She mentioned it to Catherine, who mentioned it to Richard, and suddenly my moment of stolen joy became evidence of inappropriate behavior. "I think you're getting too attached," Catherine said to me the next morning over her organic coffee and gluten-free toast. "It's not healthy, for you or for Thomas." I wanted to ask her what exactly was unhealthy about loving a child, about celebrating his milestones, about being present for the moments that mattered. Instead, I nodded and promised to maintain better professional boundaries. But how do you love a child halfway? How do you care for their physical needs while protecting your heart from their emotional ones? Thomas didn't understand professional boundaries. When he had nightmares, he cried for me. When he fell and scraped his knee, he ran to my arms for comfort. When he was sick, he wanted me to hold him. And I did hold him, because that's what love looks like in the middle of the night when a child is afraid and everyone else is asleep. The seasons changed. Thomas grew from a baby into a toddler, walking steadily, saying new words every day, developing the personality that would shape who he became. I was there for all of it. The tantrums and the breakthroughs, the messy meals and the bedtime stories, the quiet moments when he would fall asleep against my shoulder while I hummed the same lullabies my grandmother had sung to me. Richard's business continued to grow. His investment portfolio expanded into new markets, more real estate, more stocks, substantial holdings in Bitcoin that made him even wealthier as cryptocurrency values soared. He hired additional staff to manage his various properties, established a foundation for tax purposes, and bought Catherine a penthouse in Miami as an anniversary gift. With all that success came longer hours, more travel, bigger deals that required his constant attention. He trusted me completely with Thomas now, but his presence in our daily routine became increasingly rare. He was building generational wealth, securing his family's financial future, but missing the small moments that make up a child's life. Catherine, meanwhile, had found her calling in New York's social scene. She served on the boards of 3 different charities, organized fundraising galas that raised millions for various causes, and was frequently photographed at cultural events around the city. Her calendar was always full of important appointments, meaningful work that made a difference in the world. At least, that's how she explained it when people asked why she was never home with her son. I didn't judge them for their choices. Richard was providing security and opportunities that most children could only dream of. Catherine was using her privilege to help others, channeling her wealth and connections toward charitable work. They were both doing important things with their lives. But Thomas was learning to walk in an apartment where his footsteps echoed off marble floors, and there was usually only one person there to celebrate each wobbly step. The loneliness of caring for someone else's child in someone else's house is a particular kind of isolation. You're essential but invisible, needed but not valued, present for everything but belonging to nothing. You watch a family's life unfold around you while remaining forever on the periphery, close enough to love but too distant to matter. I ate my meals in the kitchen while the family dined in the formal dining room. I spent holidays working while they traveled to visit relatives who didn't know I existed. I received a Christmas bonus instead of Christmas gifts, a professional courtesy rather than personal affection. The other staff, Maria the housekeeper, Carlos the driver, Janet the cook who came 3 times a week, we formed our own small community in the spaces between the family's lives. We shared coffee in the early mornings before the house woke up, compared stories about our employers, offered each other the small kindnesses that made our invisible work bearable. But even among them, I was different. They went home at night to their own families, their own lives outside these marble walls. I lived here, surrounded by luxury that would never be mine, caring for a child who called me mama, but would never truly be my son. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in March when Thomas was almost 2 years old. Richard had been working on a massive deal, a commercial development project in downtown Manhattan worth over $200 million. His partners included international investors, and the financing involved complex arrangements with multiple banks, cryptocurrency holdings as collateral, and stock options that could double his net worth if everything went according to plan. He'd been working 18-hour days for weeks, sometimes sleeping in his office rather than coming home. When he was in the apartment, he was distracted, constantly checking his phone. His attention scattered across spreadsheets and conference calls that determined the futures of hundreds of employees. Catherine was equally busy with plans for the annual Children's Hospital Gala, an event she was chairing that would raise over $5 million for pediatric care. The irony wasn't lost on me. She would spend months organizing an event to help other people's children, while her own son ate breakfast alone with his nanny every morning. That particular Tuesday started like any other. I woke at 6, prepared Thomas's breakfast, got him dressed and ready for his music class. Catherine was already gone, an early meeting with the event planners, and Richard was in his office on a call with investors in London. Thomas had been fighting a cold for several days, nothing serious but enough to make him cranky and clingy. He wanted me to carry him everywhere, refused to let me put him down even to tie his shoes. During music class, he sat in my lap instead of participating with the other children, his small fingers twisted in my sweater. "Mama tired?" he asked on the way home, his 2-year-old vocabulary just beginning to capture the complexity of his thoughts. "A little," I admitted. I was always tired, but it was more than physical exhaustion. It was the weariness of loving someone you couldn't claim, of being essential but unrecognized, of giving everything while knowing it could be taken away at any moment. When we returned to the apartment, I found Catherine waiting in the living room with a woman I'd never seen before, young, maybe 25, with perfect teeth and highlighted hair, wearing the kind of outfit that looked casual but probably cost more than my monthly salary. "This is Miranda," Catherine announced. "She'll be taking over Thomas's care starting next week." The words hit me like cold water. I felt Thomas's grip tighten on my hand, his instinct picking up on the tension in the room, even though he couldn't understand what was happening. "I don't understand," I managed to say. Catherine's smile was bright and sharp as glass. "Richard and I have decided that Thomas needs someone younger, more energetic, someone who can keep up with him better." I looked at Miranda, who had the decency to seem uncomfortable with the situation. She was probably a lovely girl, might even be good with children, but she didn't know that Thomas liked his sandwiches cut into triangles, not squares. She didn't know that he was afraid of the vacuum cleaner but loved the sound of the dishwasher. She didn't know that he slept better when someone hummed that old lullaby my grandmother had taught me. "Does Thomas get a say in this?" I asked quietly. Catherine's expression hardened. "Thomas is 2 years old. He'll adjust." But I could see in Thomas's eyes that he understood something was wrong. He pressed closer to my leg, his small hand finding mine, holding on with the desperate grip of someone who'd already lost too much in his short life. "When?" was all I managed to ask. "Friday will be your last day. That gives you the rest of the week to transition him." Transition him. As if love were something you could pass along like an instruction manual, as if the bond between us could be transferred to someone new with a few days' notice. That night, after Thomas was asleep and the apartment was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic far below, I sat in my small room and tried to understand what had gone wrong. I'd done everything they'd asked, and more. I'd loved their son, kept him safe, helped him grow into the bright, affectionate toddler he was becoming. I'd given them 3 years of my life, 3 years of getting up at night when he was sick, of celebrating his small victories, of being there for every ordinary moment that makes up a childhood. But somewhere along the way, my competence had become a threat. My devotion had become possessiveness. My love had become inappropriate. Richard found me packing the next morning. I was folding the few clothes that belonged to me, placing them carefully in the same small suitcase I'd carried when I first arrived. He stood in the doorway of my room looking uncomfortable in his $1,000 suit. "I want you to know this wasn't my decision," he said quietly. I looked up at him. This man whose son I'd saved from potential seizures, whose wife's absence I'd filled for 3 years, whose household I'd helped hold together with invisible threads of care and attention. "Whose decision was it?" I asked. He didn't answer directly. "Catherine thinks, she believes that Thomas is becoming too dependent on you, that it's not healthy for him to prefer the nanny to his mother. And what do you think?" For a moment I saw a flicker of the man who'd stood beside me in that hospital waiting room, who'd trusted my judgment when his son was in distress. But then his phone buzzed with an urgent message about his real estate deal, and the moment passed. "I think what's best for Thomas is what matters most," he said finally. "Then why are you letting her do this?" He didn't have an answer for that, or maybe he did but couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. "Severance pay," he explained. 3 months' salary plus a bonus, and a reference letter. I took the envelope without looking inside. Money couldn't ease the ache of separation, couldn't fill the gap that losing Thomas would leave in my heart. But it would help me survive until I found another position with another family who would need me until they didn't anymore. "Will you tell him?" I asked. "When he asks for me?" Richard's jaw tightened. "We think it's better if he forgets. Children are resilient. He'll adjust to Miranda quickly." Forget. They wanted him to forget me, to erase 3 years of shared moments, to pretend I'd never existed. They wanted to rewrite his history without me in it, as if love could be edited out like a mistake. That afternoon, while Catherine was out and Miranda was having her orientation with Richard, I took Thomas to Central Park one last time. We fed the ducks, played on the playground, sat on our favorite bench while he ate the animal crackers I'd packed for him. He was happy, chattering about everything he saw, occasionally running back to me for hugs or to share some small discovery. "Mama, look," he called, pointing at a squirrel that was boldly approaching other park visitors. "Squirrel hungry!" I looked and praised his observation and helped him understand why we shouldn't try to pet wild animals. Normal moments, the kind we'd shared hundreds of times before. But this time I was memorizing everything. The way he scrunched his nose when he concentrated, the particular pitch of his laugh when something delighted him, the warm weight of his small hand in mine. When it was time to go home, he came willingly, trusting as always that tomorrow would bring another adventure together. He didn't know he was saying goodbye to more than just the park. That night, I gave Thomas his bath and helped him into his pajamas for the last time. I read him 3 stories instead of the usual 2, letting him pick his favorites from the shelf we'd built together over the years. He fell asleep in my arms while I hummed the lullaby that had always calmed him, the same melody my grandmother had sung to me, that I'd sung to my own daughter in the brief time I'd held her, that I'd sung to dozens of children who'd passed through my care over the decades. I sat there holding him long after his breathing deepened into sleep, memorizing the weight of him, the trust of his relaxed body against mine, the sweet scent of baby shampoo and innocence. Tomorrow, Miranda would put him to bed. Next week, when he cried out in the night, she would be the one to comfort him. Next month, when he mentioned me, they would distract him until the memory faded. But tonight, he was still mine in the only way he'd ever been mine. Completely, temporarily, with a love that had nowhere to go but into the moment itself. Friday morning came too soon and not soon enough. I'd spent the week trying to prepare Thomas for my departure. Though how do you explain abandonment to a 2-year-old who trusts that the people who love him will always be there? "Mama going bye-bye," I told him during breakfast, the words catching in my throat. He looked up from his cereal, milk on his chin, confusion clouding his bright eyes. "Mama come back?" "Miranda is going to take care of you now," I said, gesturing toward the young woman who was watching us with something that might have been sympathy. "She's very nice." But Thomas wasn't interested in Miranda. He climbed out of his high chair and wrapped his arms around my legs, holding on with the fierce determination of someone who understood more than his words could express. "No bye-bye, Mama," he said, his voice small but firm. "Stay." I knelt down to his level, taking his small face in my hands, looking into eyes that were so much like his father's, but filled with an openness that Richard had lost somewhere along the way to building his fortune. "I love you," I whispered, the tears I'd been holding back finally spilling over. "I will always love you. Remember that, okay?" He nodded solemnly, though I doubt he understood the weight of what I was asking him to carry. Catherine appeared in the kitchen doorway, checking her designer watch impatiently. "The car is here," she announced. "You don't want to be late for your next appointment." I didn't have a next appointment. I had nowhere to go except back to the employment agency, back to searching for another family who would need me until they grew tired of needing me. But I gathered my dignity around me like armor and picked up my small suitcase, the same one I'd carried into this apartment 3 years earlier. Thomas followed me to the door, his small feet pattering on the marble floor. When I stopped to turn the handle, he crashed into my legs one more time, holding on as if he could prevent my leaving through sheer will. "Bye-bye, Thomas," I whispered, gently untangling his arms from around my knees. "Be good for Miranda." "No," he said, the word sharp with betrayal and confusion. "Mama, stay!" I looked back once from the elevator and saw him standing in the doorway with Miranda's hand on his shoulder, his face crumpled with tears he was too young to understand. Catherine had already disappeared back into the apartment, her part in this drama complete. The elevator doors closed, cutting off the sound of his cries, cutting off 3 years of my life as cleanly as a blade. I spent that first week in a small hotel room near the agency, waiting for new job interviews, trying to convince myself that walking away from Thomas had been the professional thing to do. Children were resilient, as Richard had said. They forgot quickly, moved on, attached to new caregivers without the messy complications of adult emotions. But late at night, lying in that narrow bed listening to the sounds of the city beyond my window, I couldn't forget the weight of his small body in my arms, the trust in his eyes when he called me Mama, the way he'd held onto my legs like he could anchor me to his world through love alone. The agency found me a new position within 10 days. Twins, 18 months old, family in Brooklyn Heights with new money from cryptocurrency investments, good salary, reasonable hours, parents who seemed kind and involved. I should have been grateful. I should have been ready to start over, to invest my heart in new children who would need me until they didn't. Instead, I found myself thinking about Thomas constantly. Was Miranda singing to him at bedtime, or did he cry himself to sleep? Did she know to cut his sandwiches into triangles, to warm his milk to exactly the right temperature, to stay with him until he fell asleep because he was afraid of the dark? Did he still ask for me, or had they already begun the process of helping him forget? 2 weeks after leaving the Blackstone apartment, I was pushing the twin stroller through Brooklyn Bridge Park when I saw him, Richard standing near the water with his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing as he spoke to whoever was on the other end of his business call. He looked tired, older somehow, as if the weight of his success was finally showing on his face. For a moment, I considered turning around, finding a different path through the park, avoiding the confrontation that would only reopen wounds that had barely begun to heal. But something made me continue forward, made me curious about this chance encounter. He saw me before I could decide whether to speak to him. His conversation faltered for a moment, Then he said something quick to whoever was on the phone and ended the call. "Margaret," he said, my name sounding strange in his mouth after weeks of absence. "Mr. Blackstone." I kept my voice neutral, professional, though my heart was beating faster than it should have been. He looked at the twins in the stroller, taking in the reality that I'd moved on, found another family to care for, another set of children who would call me when they were frightened or hurt. "How is Thomas?" I asked before I could stop myself. His expression tightened. "Fine, he's adjusting." "And Miranda?" "She's very dedicated," he said, but something in his tone suggested that dedication wasn't the same as love, that competence wasn't the same as understanding. We stood there in awkward silence, two people who'd shared something important, but had never quite figured out what to call it. He'd been my employer, I'd been his employee. He'd been the father, I'd been the nanny. But those labels didn't capture the weight of shared responsibility, the mutual recognition that had developed between us over Thomas's care. "He asks for you," Richard said finally, the admission seeming to cost him something. "Every day? Every day." He looked out at the water, at the Manhattan skyline beyond where his empire of glass and steel generated wealth, while he stood in a park missing his son's questions about where Mama had gone. "What do you tell him?" "That you had to go take care of other children, that you couldn't stay forever." He paused. "Catherine thinks he'll forget soon." But I could see in his eyes that Thomas wasn't forgetting, that the questions weren't getting easier to answer, that maybe some bonds couldn't be severed as cleanly as Catherine had believed. "Does he sleep through the night?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. Richard shook his head. "He has nightmares. Miranda doesn't. She doesn't know how to comfort him the way you did, the way I did, by holding him until the fear passed, by humming that old lullaby, by staying present in the darkness until he felt safe enough to let go of consciousness again. Love disguised as professional competence, attachment masquerading as childcare skills. "Give him time," I said, though the words felt false. "Children adapt." "Do they?" Richard asked, and for a moment he sounded less like a millionaire businessman and more like a father who was beginning to understand the difference between providing for a child and nurturing one. One of the twins, Emma, began to fuss in her stroller, drawing my attention back to my current reality. I checked her diaper, adjusted her blanket, offered her a pacifier with the automatic competence of someone who'd been caring for children longer than she cared to remember. Richard watched me work, and I wondered if he was remembering similar moments with Thomas, times when my hands had moved with that same practiced efficiency to solve problems and ease distress. "I should go," I said finally. "The twins need their lunch." He nodded but didn't move to leave. "Margaret?" I turned back. "Thank you for everything you did for Thomas, for everything you are." The acknowledgement came 3 weeks too late and felt both precious and painful. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I tried to respond. As I pushed the stroller away from him, back toward Brooklyn Heights and my new life with my new family, I heard his phone ring again. Another call about another deal. Another opportunity to expand his wealth and influence, while his son wondered why the woman who'd loved him had disappeared without explanation. The twins were good children, easier in many ways than Thomas had been. They slept better, ate without fussing, played contentedly with simple toys. Their parents, David and Sarah Chen, were tech entrepreneurs who'd made their fortune in cryptocurrency mining and blockchain development. They worked from home often, were present for meals and bedtime routines, treated me with respect and genuine appreciation. It should have been everything I'd learned to hope for in an employer. But every night when I went to my room in their brownstone, I thought about a little boy on the Upper East Side who might be crying for someone who wasn't allowed to come comfort him. The breaking point came 6 weeks after I'd left the Blackstones. I was giving Emma her evening bottle when my phone rang, Richard's number appearing on the screen like a ghost from a previous life. I almost didn't answer. Nothing good could come from reopening that connection, from allowing myself to hope that maybe they'd realized their mistake. that maybe Thomas's need for me had proved stronger than Catherine's desire to replace me. But I answered on the fourth ring, my voice cautious. "Hello? Margaret?" Richard's voice was strained, urgent in a way I'd only heard once before. That night when Thomas had stopped breathing and we'd rushed to the hospital together. "What's wrong? It's Thomas. He hasn't been eating, barely sleeping. Miranda quit yesterday. She said she couldn't handle him anymore. Catherine's at her wit's end and His voice broke slightly. "I think he's having some kind of breakdown. He just keeps asking for you, and we don't know what to do." My heart clenched with a mixture of grief and vindication. Thomas hadn't forgotten me. Thomas hadn't adjusted. Thomas was grieving the loss of someone he'd loved, and no one in his world understood how to help him heal. "Where's Catherine?" I asked. "At her mother's in Connecticut. She said she needed a break, that Thomas was becoming impossible to manage." So Catherine had run away when her son's pain became inconvenient, leaving Richard to deal with the consequences of their decision to dismiss me. The irony was bitter. The woman who'd wanted me gone was now nowhere to be found when her child needed her most. "What do you want from me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Help, please. I know we don't deserve it after what we did to you, but Thomas needs someone who understands him. Someone who loves him," I thought but didn't say. "Someone who sees him as more than an adorable accessory to a successful life." "This is temporary," I warned, "just until you find someone permanent." "Of course," Richard agreed quickly. "Whatever you need, whatever it takes." But as I hung up the phone and began explaining to the Chens why I needed to take an emergency leave of absence, I wondered if any of us really believed this would be temporary. Thomas had marked me as surely as I'd marked him, and some bonds, once formed, refused to be broken no matter how inconvenient they became. I arrived at the Blackstone apartment that evening to find Richard pacing the living room like a caged animal, his expensive suit wrinkled, his hair disheveled from running his hands through it. The confident millionaire who controlled millions in assets looked completely lost when faced with one small, heartbroken child. "Where is he?" I asked. "His room. He won't come out, won't eat, barely speaks except to ask for you." Richard's relief at seeing me was palpable. I didn't know who else to call. I climbed those familiar marble stairs, my footsteps echoing in the apartment that felt both like home and like exile. Thomas's door was closed, and I could hear soft whimpering from inside, not the healthy crying of a frustrated toddler, but something deeper and more desperate. I knocked gently. "Thomas, it's Mama." The whimpering stopped. Then I heard small feet running across the floor, and the door opened to reveal a little boy who looked like he'd lost weight, whose eyes were red-rimmed from crying, whose face lit up with joy and relief when he saw me standing there. "Mama!" he cried, launching himself into my arms with the force of someone who'd thought he'd lost everything and suddenly found it again. I held him close, feeling how his small body seemed to melt against mine, how his breathing gradually slowed from panic to peaceful. He was bigger than he'd been 6 weeks ago, his vocabulary expanded, his hair longer. But the core of him, the essence that had called to every maternal instinct I possessed, was unchanged. "I'm here," I whispered into his hair. "I'm here now." "Mama stay?" he asked, pulling back to look at my face with eyes that held too much fear for someone so young. "For now," I promised. "Let's get you some dinner, okay?" He nodded eagerly and took my hand, leading me downstairs with more energy than he'd shown in weeks. Richard watched from the kitchen doorway as I prepared Thomas's favorite meal: grilled cheese cut into triangles, apple slices, milk in his special cup with the cartoon characters on it. "How did you know?" Richard asked as Thomas ate hungrily for the first time since I'd left. "Know what?" "That he needed this specific meal, this specific way." I looked at Thomas. sauce from his grilled cheese smeared on his cheek, contentment radiating from his small body as he ate food prepared by someone who understood his preferences. "I pay attention," I said simply. That night, I put Thomas to bed in the room that had once been as familiar to me as my own. He clung to me through the bedtime routine, afraid to let me out of his sight, afraid that morning might bring another disappearance. "Sing," he requested, snuggling against me in his small bed. I hummed the lullaby that had always calmed him, watching as his breathing deepened and his grip on my hand gradually relaxed. When I was certain he was deeply asleep, I tried to slip out of the room, but his eyes opened immediately. "Mama go?" he asked, panic creeping back into his voice. "I'm just going to my room," I assured him. "I'll be right down the hall." Sleep here? I shouldn't have. Professional boundaries, appropriate limits, all the things Catherine had lectured me about before firing me. But looking at this child who'd been abandoned by everyone who was supposed to protect him, whose trust had been shattered by adults who said they loved him, I couldn't bring myself to care about professional boundaries. I slept in the chair beside his bed that night, waking every few hours to find his small hand reaching out to touch my arm, reassuring himself that I was still there. By morning, he seemed calmer, more like the confident, happy child he'd been before his world had been turned upside down. Richard found me in the kitchen making breakfast, Thomas sitting in his high chair chattering about his dreams while he ate his cereal. "He looks better," Richard observed. "Children need consistency," I said. "They need to know that the people who love them aren't going to disappear without warning." The criticism was implicit but clear. Richard heard it, accepted it, nodded with the kind of humility that wealth couldn't buy. "I know we handled this badly," he admitted. "Catherine was... she was jealous, I think, of how much Thomas loved you. She felt like she was competing with the nanny for her own son's affection. And you? I thought she knew what was best. She's his mother, after all." "Biology isn't the same as love," I said quietly, wiping Thomas's face clean. "And titles aren't the same as understanding." Over the following days, Thomas blossomed back to his normal, happy self. His appetite returned, his sleep improved, his laughter filled the apartment again. He followed me everywhere, his small hand always finding mine. His trust gradually rebuilding as he convinced himself that this time I wouldn't leave. Richard watched our interactions with something that looked like wonder. He'd seen me care for Thomas before, but now he seemed to notice details he'd previously overlooked. The way Thomas's whole body relaxed when I held him, how he looked to me automatically when he was hurt or confused, the wordless communication that had developed between us over years of shared days. "How do you do it?" he asked one afternoon. We were in the park watching Thomas play on the swings, while other nannies and mothers supervised their own charges nearby. "Do what?" "Make it look so easy. Love him so completely." I considered the question, watching this man who could negotiate billion-dollar deals but couldn't figure out how to connect with his own 2-year-old son. "I don't have anything else competing for my attention," I said finally. "When I'm with Thomas, he's my whole world, not part of it, all of it." Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I want to learn, to be better at this. Then pay attention. Put the phone away. Get down on his level. Follow his lead instead of trying to make him follow yours." It was advice I'd wanted to give him for years but had never felt allowed to offer. Now, with Thomas's well-being hanging in the balance, the normal hierarchies felt less important than honesty. That evening, Richard joined us for Thomas's bedtime routine for the first time since I'd returned. He sat quietly as I gave Thomas his bath, helped him into his pajamas, read him stories. When Thomas requested his lullaby, Richard listened to the melody I'd been humming for years, learning the tune that could calm his son when nothing else would. "Daddy, sing," Thomas requested, looking at his father with hopeful eyes. Richard looked panicked. I'm not good at singing." "Doesn't matter," I assured him. "He just wants to hear your voice." So Richard hummed along shakily, his voice uncertain but earnest. Thomas grinned with delight, clapping his small hands together at this unexpected participation from his father. When Thomas was finally asleep, Richard walked with me to the kitchen where I was preparing bottles for the next day, a routine so automatic I barely thought about it anymore. 3 years, he said suddenly. What? You did that every single night for 3 years. The bath, the stories, the lullaby. Every single night, whether you were sick or tired or had other things you wanted to do. I looked up at him, this man who was just beginning to understand the weight of what parenting actually required. That's what love looks like, I said simply. I'm sorry, he said then, the words heavy with recognition of how badly they'd misjudged everything. For what Catherine said, for how we treated you, for not seeing, he gestured helplessly, for not seeing that you were the best thing that ever happened to Thomas. The apology was 3 years overdue, but it still meant something, maybe because it came from understanding rather than guilt, from recognition rather than obligation. Where is Catherine? I asked. His jaw tightened. Still in Connecticut. She says she can't handle Thomas when he's like this, when he's so attached to you. She wants... He paused as if saying the words out loud might make them real. She wants me to choose between her and having you back permanently. The ultimatum hung between us like a challenge. Catherine had created this crisis by insisting I be fired, then abandoned her family when the consequences became uncomfortable. Now she was demanding that Richard choose between his wife's ego and his son's emotional well-being. What will you do? I asked. I don't know, he admitted. 6 months ago, I would have said the decision was obvious. You choose your wife, your partner, the mother of your children. But watching Thomas these past few weeks, seeing how he is without you. He ran a hand through his hair. I can't do that to him again. I won't. That night, I sat in my small room off the kitchen and tried to understand what was happening. I'd come back temporarily to help Thomas through a crisis, but nothing about this situation felt temporary anymore. The child I'd loved and lost had reclaimed me as surely as I'd reclaimed him. Richard was beginning to understand something about parenting that his wealth and success had never taught him, and Catherine was forcing them all toward a choice that might tear the family apart. I thought about my own daughter, the one I'd given up for adoption 40 years earlier. I'd made that choice believing it was what was best for her, that a stable family with 2 parents and financial security would give her opportunities I couldn't provide as a single teenage mother. But I'd never stopped wondering if I'd chosen correctly, never stopped grieving the relationship we'd never had. Now I was facing a different version of that same choice. Stay and risk destroying Thomas's family, or leave and destroy Thomas himself. But the decision wasn't really mine to make. Catherine held all the cards, the marriage, the social position, the legal claim to motherhood. I was just the nanny, however much love might complicate that simple title. The call came 3 days later. Catherine, crisp and determined, informing Richard that she was returning to the city and expected to find the situation resolved when she arrived. What does that mean? He asked. It means Margaret goes, permanently this time, or I do. I overheard the conversation from the kitchen, where I was preparing Thomas's lunch while he played with blocks nearby. The ultimatum was clear. Catherine would rather destroy her marriage than share her son's love with someone she considered hired help. That evening, after Thomas was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Richard found me in my room. I was packing again, the same small suitcase that had carried my belongings in and out of this family's life twice now. You don't have to leave, he said from the doorway. Yes, I do. I folded a sweater carefully, trying to keep my hands steady. Thomas needs his mother, even if she's not perfect. He needs his family intact. His family includes you. No, it doesn't. The words hurt to say, but they were true in the only way that mattered legally and socially. I'm the nanny. I've always been just the nanny. That's not how Thomas sees it. Thomas is 2 years old. He'll adapt eventually. Children do. But even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. Thomas wasn't adapting to my absence. He was grieving it. And if I left again, especially after promising him I would stay, the damage might be irreparable. Richard sat down in the small chair by my window, his expensive suit incongruous in my modest space. What if Catherine's wrong? What if there's another way? Like what? I don't know. A compromise. Shared custody, maybe. Thomas stays with you during the week, comes home on weekends. I looked at him with something between pity and amazement. This man who could structure billion-dollar deals, who understood the complexities of international finance and cryptocurrency markets, genuinely believed he could negotiate his way out of an emotional crisis. This isn't a business transaction, I said gently. You can't split a child's heart between competing interests and expect it to function properly. Then what do I do? The question hung between us, heavy with implications neither of us wanted to fully acknowledge. What he was really asking was whether I thought his son's emotional well-being was worth risking his marriage for, whether love could be measured against social convention and found worthy of the sacrifice. You do what you think is right, I said finally, and you live with the consequences. The next morning brought Catherine's return, the click of expensive heels on marble floors, the rustle of designer clothing, the scent of perfume that cost more than some families spent on groceries. She swept through the apartment like a storm, checking to see what had changed in her absence, reasserting her ownership of the space and everything in it. Thomas heard her voice and came running, the way any child would run to a mother he hadn't seen in weeks. But I noticed he stopped just short of throwing himself into her arms, something cautious in his small body that hadn't been there before. "Mommy," he said, his voice bright with the joy children feel at familiar faces. Catherine knelt down and embraced him, but there was something stiff about the interaction, something performed rather than felt. "I missed you, baby," she said. "Were you good for Daddy?" Over Thomas's head, she looked directly at me. The message was clear. I was supposed to be gone by now. This reunion was supposed to take place without witnesses to complicate the narrative she'd constructed. "Hello, Catherine," I said evenly. "Margaret," her smile was sharp as glass, "I thought we'd discussed your situation." "Mrs. Blackstone," Richard said, appearing in the doorway with the look of a man preparing for battle. "We need to talk." "Yes," she agreed. "We do." They disappeared into Richard's office, voices rising beyond the closed door. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was clear. Catherine furious and demanding, Richard defensive and uncertain. Throughout it all, Thomas played with his toys, occasionally looking toward the office door with the kind of anxious attention children develop when they learn to read emotional weather patterns. The argument lasted over an hour. When they finally emerged, Catherine's perfect composure had cracked slightly. Her cheeks flushed, her hair less than perfectly arranged. Richard looked exhausted, like a man who'd just fought a war and wasn't sure whether he'd won or lost. Catherine walked directly to where I was sitting on the floor with Thomas, building a castle out of colored blocks. "I think there's been some confusion," she said, her voice controlled but edged with steel, "about your role here and how long it was meant to last." I looked up at her. This woman whose son I'd loved for 3 years, who dismissed me without a second thought, who'd abandoned her family when the consequences became inconvenient. "No confusion," I said quietly. "I understand my role perfectly." "Good. Then you understand that Thomas doesn't need you anymore, that it's time for his real family to take care of him." "He still asks for you," Thomas said suddenly, the words shocking in their clarity and timing. At 2, his grammar wasn't perfect, but his meaning was unmistakable. "Every night." "Where Mama?" he say. Catherine's face went pale. "Thomas, honey, I'm your mama. Margaret is just—" "My mama, too," Thomas said firmly, wrapping his small arms around my neck with the possessive certainty of someone who'd already lost more than he could bear to lose again. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Here was the truth that no one wanted to acknowledge: that love doesn't respect titles or biological connections, that the child they were fighting over had already made his own choice about who belonged in his world. Richard spoke first. "Catherine, maybe we should consider—" "No." Her voice cut through his words like a blade. "I won't negotiate about this. I won't compete with the help for my own son's affection." "She's not the help," Richard said quietly. "She's family." The words hung in the air between them, revolutionary in their simplicity. She's family. Not an employee, not a service provider, not a temporary convenience. Family. Catherine stared at her husband as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "She is not family," she said, each word precise and cold. "Family is blood. Family is marriage. Family is legal connection and social recognition. She is a nanny who forgot her place." "My place," I said, standing slowly with Thomas still in my arms, "has always been wherever this child needed me to be." Catherine's controls finally snapped. "Your place is wherever I say it is. This is my home, my son, my family. You have no right to any of it." Thomas began to cry. Not the normal crying of a frustrated toddler, but the desperate wails of someone who felt the foundation of his world shaking again. I held him closer, murmuring soft reassurances while he pressed his face against my shoulder. "Look what you're doing to him," Richard said to his wife, his voice heavy with recognition and disappointment. "Look what she's doing to him," Catherine shot back. "Confusing him, making him think she's more important than his real mother. It's manipulation, emotional abuse." The accusation hung between us like poison. Emotional abuse, loving a child too much, caring too deeply, being present for every ordinary moment that makes up a childhood. If that was abuse, then every mother who'd ever soothed a nightmare or celebrated a first step was guilty. "If loving Thomas is abuse," I said quietly, "then I'm guilty. But if abandoning him when his needs become inconvenient is parenting, then maybe we need to redefine our terms." Catherine's face flushed with rage. "How dare you? Stop!" Richard's voice cut through the argument with unexpected authority. "Both of you, just stop." He looked at his son, still crying in my arms, then at his wife, beautiful and furious and absolutely unwilling to compromise. Then at me, holding the child who'd called me mama since he could speak, who'd never learned to differentiate between biological love and chosen love. "I can't do this anymore," he said finally. "I can't watch Thomas get hurt because the adults in his life can't figure out how to share loving him." "Share?" Catherine laughed bitterly. "I don't share my children with anyone, especially not with hired help who doesn't know their place." "Then maybe," Richard said slowly, the words seeming to surprise him even as he spoke them, "the problem isn't that Margaret doesn't know her place. Maybe the problem is that you don't know yours." The accusation landed like a slap. Catherine stared at her husband, at the man who'd built an empire while she'd built a social life, who'd trusted her judgment about their son until faced with the consequences of her choices. "My place," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "is as Thomas's mother. My place is as your wife. My place is as the woman who married you when you were nobody, who built this life with you, who gave you the son you're willing to throw away for a nanny." "I'm not throwing Thomas away," Richard replied. "I'm trying to save him." "By choosing her over me?" The question demanded an answer that would define everything that came after. Richard looked at his wife, then at me, then at Thomas, who had stopped crying and was watching the adults with the solemn attention of someone learning hard lessons about how love works in the grown-up world. "I'm choosing Thomas." Richard said finally. "I'm choosing what's best for my son over what's easiest for the rest of us." Catherine stared at him for a long moment, then turned to look at me with something that might have been grudging recognition. Not respect. She would never respect someone she considered beneath her social station, but recognition that she'd lost, that love had proved stronger than law, that the child she'd tried to claim exclusively had already chosen where his heart belonged. "Fine," she said, the word sharp with finality, "but don't expect me to stay and watch you make a fool of yourself over the help." She turned and walked out of the room, her heels clicking against the marble floor with the same authority she'd carried when she'd first returned. But now the sound was hollow, empty, the footsteps of someone walking away from everything that mattered because she couldn't bear to share it. That night, as I put Thomas to bed in a house that felt fundamentally different despite looking exactly the same, he asked the question I'd been wondering myself. "Mommy comes back?" "I don't know, sweetheart," I admitted. "Maybe someday." "You stay?" It was the question that had haunted both of us for months, the uncertainty that had shattered his sense of security and left him grieving for someone who was still alive. "I stay," I promised, the words feeling both like victory and surrender. Thomas smiled then, the first completely peaceful expression I'd seen on his face since I'd left months earlier. "Good," he said, with the absolute certainty of someone who'd finally gotten the answer he needed. After he was asleep, I found Richard in his office, surrounded by paperwork but not working on any of it. The deals that usually consumed his attention seemed unimportant compared to the personal crisis he'd just navigated. "She might come back," he said without looking up, "when she calms down, when she realizes what she's giving up. And if she does?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering. "Then we'll figure out how to make it work, all of us. Together. And if she doesn't? Then Thomas and I figure out how to move forward without her." It wasn't the answer I'd expected from a man who'd spent his marriage deferring to his wife's judgment, who'd fired me because she'd demanded it, who'd always seemed more comfortable with balance sheets than with emotional complexity. "What changed?" I asked. "Watching him without you," Richard said simply. "Seeing what it did to him when we took away the person he loved most, I realized that protecting Catherine's feelings wasn't worth destroying Thomas's trust in the world." 6 months later, Catherine filed for divorce. The proceedings were swift and relatively amicable by Manhattan standards. She got the Miami penthouse, a generous settlement, and enough alimony to maintain her social position. Richard kept Thomas, the Manhattan apartment, and the responsibility of raising a son who would grow up knowing that love sometimes required choosing one person's needs over another's desires. I stayed, no longer as a nanny, but as something indefinable, family, in the way Richard had named it that day, when everything changed. Thomas started calling Richard Daddy more often, began looking to him for comfort and approval, but I remained Mama in the way that mattered most, the person he trusted absolutely, the constant in his young life. The wealthy social circles that had once included both Blackstones largely sided with Catherine in the divorce. It was easier to understand her position. The abandoned wife, the mother forced to choose between her dignity and her son. Richard became something of a social pariah, the millionaire who'd chosen his nanny over his wife, who destroyed his marriage for the help. But Thomas thrived. He grew confident and happy, secure in the knowledge that the people who loved him weren't going anywhere. He learned to read with me in the afternoons, practiced piano with the teacher Richard hired, played soccer in Central Park on weekends when his father could take time away from managing their fortune. On quiet Sunday mornings, the three of us would have breakfast together in the kitchen. Not the formal dining room Catherine had preferred, but the warm space where Thomas felt comfortable spilling orange juice and asking endless questions about everything he observed. Richard learned to make pancakes. I taught Thomas to help cook eggs. and we built something that looked nothing like the traditional family Catherine had wanted, but felt infinitely more real. The transformation in Richard was remarkable. The man who'd once been too busy to notice his son's distress became someone who asked detailed questions about Thomas's day, who knew his favorite books, who could calm nightmares and celebrate small victories. He still worked. His business empire required constant attention, but he'd learned to create boundaries between professional obligations and personal priorities. One evening, when Thomas was almost 4, he was playing with blocks in the living room while Richard and I cleaned up after dinner. It was an ordinary moment, the kind of peaceful domestic scene that would have been impossible during Catherine's reign. "Mama," Thomas called, looking up from his construction project, "when I grow up, will you still be my mama?" The question was innocent, born from a child's need to understand permanence in a world where adults sometimes disappeared without warning. But it touched something deep in my heart, the fear I still carried that this happiness was temporary, that someday another crisis would force another choice. "Always," I promised him. "No matter how big you get or how far you go, I'll always be your mama." "Good," he said with satisfaction, then returned to building what looked like a castle made of colored blocks. Richard caught my eye across the kitchen, smiling at the certainty in his son's voice. "He's not wrong," he said quietly, "about the always part." That night, after Thomas was asleep and the apartment was quiet, I sat in the chair by my bedroom window and thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The years of caring for other people's children while grieving the daughter I'd given away. The love I'd poured into Thomas, the way he'd filled the empty spaces in my heart that had ached for decades. The choice Richard had made to keep our unconventional family together, whatever the social cost. I thought about Catherine, somewhere in Miami or Connecticut or wherever she'd gone to rebuild her life without the complications we represented. I hoped she'd found peace, happiness, maybe even a deeper understanding of what motherhood actually required. But I couldn't regret the choice she'd forced, the ultimatum that had finally made everyone acknowledge what Thomas had known all along, that love transcends titles, that family is created by dedication rather than biology. A year later, something extraordinary happened. I was shopping for Thomas's birthday party supplies when my phone rang, a number I didn't recognize, a voice I hadn't heard in over 40 years. "Is this Margaret Walsh?" the caller asked, uncertainty threading through the words. "Yes," I replied cautiously. "My name is Sarah Martinez now, but I think I might be your daughter." The world stopped. The bustling Manhattan street around me faded to white noise, the party supplies in my cart forgotten as I processed words I dreamed of hearing for 4 decades. "Sarah," I whispered, her name still perfect on my tongue after all these years. "I hired a private investigator," she continued, her voice nervous but determined. "I've been looking for you for years. I know you gave me up when I was born, and I want you to know I'm not angry about that. I understand why you had to make that choice, but I've wanted to meet you my whole life." Tears I'd been holding back for 40 years finally spilled over. "I've wanted to meet you too," I managed, "every day since I said goodbye." We arranged to meet that weekend at a coffee shop in the village, neutral territory where we could navigate this impossible reunion without the pressure of anyone else's expectations. I told Richard and Thomas about the meeting. How do you explain to a 4-year-old that his mama had another child once, one she'd loved enough to let go? "So I have a sister?" Thomas asked, trying to work out the relationships with the literal logic of someone still learning how families fit together. "Not exactly," I said carefully. "Sarah is my daughter, which makes her, well, she's your mama's daughter, but she has her own family now, her own life." Richard understood the weight of what was happening, the chance to reclaim something I'd lost, to heal a wound that had shaped my entire adult life. "Do you want me to come with you?" he offered. It was tempting. the support of someone who knew me well enough to understand what this meant. But this meeting belonged to Sarah and me, to two women who shared DNA and 40 years of wondering about each other. I met her at 3 o'clock on a sunny Saturday afternoon, recognizing her immediately despite never having seen a photo. She had my eyes, my hands, the stubborn set to her jaw that I remembered from my own teenage reflection. But she also had confidence I'd never possessed at her age. The security of someone who'd grown up knowing she was wanted and loved. We talked for 4 hours, sharing the highlights and heartbreaks of lives lived separately, but somehow still connected. She was a teacher, married to a kind man named David, mother to 2 children I was suddenly a grandmother to. She'd had a good life, a happy childhood with parents who'd loved her unconditionally, opportunities I could never have provided as a teenager with no resources. "I don't blame you," she said when I tried to apologize for the choice I'd made. "I understand now that I'm a mother myself. You gave me the best life you could, even though it meant giving me up." The forgiveness was a gift I hadn't dared hope for. Healing that reached back through decades to comfort the young woman who'd made an impossible choice with love as her only guide. "Tell me about Thomas," she said toward the end of our meeting. "He sounds like a lucky little boy." I told her about Thomas, about the family we'd built from love and loss, about the way children can heal hearts you didn't even know were broken. I showed her pictures on my phone, Thomas building block castles, Thomas learning to ride a bike, Thomas asleep in my arms after a bedtime story. "You're a wonderful mother," Sarah said, studying the photos with something that looked like pride. "I'm glad you got another chance." Another chance. That's exactly what Thomas had been. The opportunity to love a child completely, to be present for all the small moments I'd missed with Sarah, to mother someone who could stay. When I returned home that evening, Richard was waiting in the living room while Thomas played quietly with his toys nearby. One look at my face told him how the meeting had gone. "She's beautiful," I said. "Kind, happy, successful, everything I hoped she'd be." "Are you okay?" he asked, understanding that joy and grief often occupy the same space in the human heart. "I'm complete," I realized, the words surprising me with their truth. For the first time in 40 years, I feel complete. Thomas looked up from his toys then, running to me with the automatic affection of someone who'd never doubted his place in my heart. "Mama back," he announced, wrapping his small arms around my legs. "Mama's back," I agreed, lifting him up to hold him close. "Mama's always back." That night, as I put Thomas to bed in his room filled with toys and books and evidence of a childhood lived fully, he asked another of his thoughtful questions. "Are you happy, Mama?" It was such a simple question, but it touched everything I'd learned about love and loss, about the choices we make and the gifts we receive, about the way broken hearts can heal stronger than they were before. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, meaning it completely. "I'm very happy." "Good," he said with the satisfaction of someone who understood that his mama's happiness was connected to his own security. "I love you, Mama." "I love you too, Thomas, always and forever." As I turned off his bedroom light and closed his door softly behind me, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The young woman who'd given up her daughter believing love meant letting go. The nanny who'd spent decades caring for other people's children while carrying grief like a secret. The woman who'd been fired for loving too much, then hired back because love proved stronger than pride. Now I was something unprecedented in my experience. A woman whose heart was full rather than empty, whose love had found permanent homes in the people who mattered most. I had a son who called me Mama without confusion or apology, a daughter who'd found me after 40 years of separation, a man who'd chosen our unconventional family over social expectations. I had, against all odds and despite every obstacle, become exactly who I was meant to be. Years passed. Thomas grew from a toddler to a little boy to a young man who never questioned that the woman who'd raised him was his real mother, regardless of biology. Richard's business empire continued to flourish. Wise investments in technology stocks, strategic purchases of Manhattan real estate, cryptocurrency holdings that appreciated faster than anyone had predicted. But he'd learned to measure wealth differently, understanding that the richest moments were often the quietest ones. Sarah became a regular part of our lives, visiting with her family for holidays and birthdays, calling to share news about her children's accomplishments, treating me with the affection of someone making up for lost time. Her kids called me Grandma Margaret, and I loved them with the fierce tenderness of someone who'd learned that family is created by choice and nurtured by presence. When Thomas graduated from high school, valedictorian, full scholarship to Columbia, young man who understood that privilege meant responsibility, he gave a speech at the ceremony that reduced me to tears. "I want to thank the woman who taught me that love isn't about biology or obligation," he said, looking directly at me in the audience. "My mama showed me that the strongest families are built on choice, that the deepest love comes from people who stay not because they have to, but because they can't imagine being anywhere else." The applause that followed was warm and knowing, coming from families who understood that the traditional definitions of motherhood and family had evolved, that love took many forms, and all of them mattered. After the ceremony, as we celebrated at home with the people who'd become our chosen family over the years, Thomas found me in the kitchen where I was preparing his favorite cake, the same chocolate recipe I'd been making for his birthdays since he was 3. "Mama," he said, using the name that had never changed despite his growing up, "I have something for you." He handed me an envelope, his expression serious in the way of young people about to do something important. Inside was a scholarship announcement. The Margaret Walsh Foundation, established to support caregivers pursuing education, named in honor of the woman who showed me that the most important job in the world is loving children who need it most. I stared at the paper, reading the words through tears that made everything blur. He'd used his college fund, money Richard had invested and grown over the years, to create something that would honor caregivers, nannies, foster parents, grandparents raising grandchildren, all the people who loved children who weren't technically theirs. "Thomas," I whispered, overcome by the generosity of the gesture. "You spent your life taking care of other people's children," he said simply. "It's time other people learned from your example." That night, as our celebration wound down and the apartment grew quiet, I sat in the chair by my bedroom window, the same chair where I'd sat so many nights over the years, wrestling with questions about love and sacrifice, about the price of caring too much and the cost of not caring enough. But now, looking out at the city lights beyond, I felt only gratitude for the journey that had brought me home to myself, for the children who'd taught me different kinds of love, for the man who'd chosen our family over convenience, for the daughter who'd found her way back to me across 40 years of separation. I thought about the young woman I'd been, giving up her baby because she believed love meant sacrifice. I thought about the nanny I'd become, pouring maternal devotion into other people's children because mine had found another home. I thought about the choice Catherine had forced, the ultimatum that had finally made everyone acknowledge what mattered most, and I realized that every heartbreak had been preparation for this joy. Every loss had made space for this abundance. Every night I'd cried myself to sleep wondering if I mattered had led to this certainty that I belonged exactly where I was. The phone rang then, interrupting my reflection. Sarah's voice, warm and familiar now, calling to check on me the way daughters do when they love their mothers. "How are you, Mom?" she asked, using the title naturally now, without awkwardness or explanation. "I'm perfect," I said, meaning it completely. "I'm absolutely perfect." And for the first time in my 70-year life, that was completely true. Now, as I sit here sharing this story with you, I wonder about your own heart. Have you ever loved someone who belonged to someone else? Have you ever been the invisible person holding a family together? Have you ever had to choose between what was easy and what was right? Tell me your story in the comments below. Tell me about the children you've loved, the sacrifices you've made, the moments when your heart broke and somehow grew stronger. If this story touched something deep inside you, please like and subscribe. It helps this message reach other women who need to know that their love matters, that their sacrifices are seen, that their hearts are worthy of the joy they've given others. For more stories that celebrate the hidden heroes among us, click on the podcast link here on the left. Thank you for walking this journey of the heart with me. Until we meet again in our next story, remember, love always finds a way home.